Hey, so this is a devlog for Legend of Rothan. I just wanted to show a little bit of the work I've been doing towards an update for Alpha 2. One of the things I've really wanted to do with this is switch to a third-person action camera because I want to use free flow combat and those work really well together. I was thinking about the camera system that I used previously, which is meant to kind of look like the older Zelda games. And I just don't think it's going to work so well with a free flow combat. Also, even if I did try to make that work, the whole system where I would try to maybe make like a dynamic system where when a room is developed, it would zoom out far enough that you could see the whole room. It actually would be quite a bit of work as well. So I decided to go with that third-person camera. So I've made third-person action cameras before, but usually it's quite a bit of work programming the collision detection stuff, using some ray casting for that, and the damping and things like that. When you set a camera just to follow a child object of the player, it ends up being pretty rigid usually. It can make people motion sick and it just doesn't look good. So I was looking around, and Cinemachine can be used for this kind of thing now, and that was kind of new to me. Followed some tutorials on that, and I found that that worked really well. I do really appreciate the damping and collision detection that are built right into it, so I didn't have to do any coding for that, just run the settings. It did take me a little bit of time to figure out how to prevent it from getting caught on the player's shield, actually, as if that was an object that was blocking the camera, but I figured out how to do that. I'm using Dungeon Architect to develop dungeons in real time. So when we run the game, it actually creates a dungeon, so I can build in the editor as well and destroy that dungeon. And I wanted to start with a view of the dungeon that zooms in towards the character, so Cinemachine supports this kind of stuff really well, so I have two separate cameras. So this camera is actually the one for the dungeon view, and then this one, the brain, has a 2-second default blend, so it blends into it. So once the dungeon architect spawns the dungeon, it does call a few functions. So one of them is actually that it's going to set up the camera. It finds my player controller and runs the setup camera function, which sets all those settings for the camera once this player is dynamically placed in the dungeon. Also enable all my nav mesh agents after the dungeon is built. And there's a mesh combiner as well that I'm now using, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So now when I run this project, there's a nice transition in from the zoomed out view so we can see what the dungeon is like before using the third person camera. So the camera fully rotates around the player, can move up and down. It does collide with the ground. If I go near a wall, it collides with the wall as well. Well, usually it does. Still some work to do with that maybe, but it does somewhat work. And the movement is camera relative. Right now the movement still feels quite clunky, so I'm going to work on that, but as you can see, if I just hold W, he runs forward. If I turn the camera, he does change direction. I can also run sideways, all camera relative, run towards the camera, run the other direction. So it's a lot like most action games. Of course, the attack is still implemented. Dungeon's going to need a roof now, and I want to do some work towards making the dungeon look better, as well as making this guy snappier. You can see some of the shortcuts I took here with the old build, because that didn't matter from the old camera view. Camera's still working, and I find the blocking is a little bit more predictable now in this view. Just behaves more like you'd expect. The top-down view, I don't think you always expected blocks to work, and they wouldn't always do it. That didn't work. There's still some work I want to do with the blocking. I'm not happy with it, but this is getting better. So one thing that I ran into was a performance problem. So Dungeon Architect does a great job of building a dynamic dungeon, but I found that without this Mesh Combine Studio, it actually had an abysmal frame rate. So I'll just comment out the combine. Just wait for that to build and then run it. And you can see here, the amount of draw calls that are going on with the mesh uncombined, it makes for an abysmal frame rate. Like, this is just terrible in editor, and I do want the game to run somewhat efficiently. Don't want it to be too hard on hardware. So this definitely isn't acceptable performance to me. So I did end up adding in this Mesh Combiner Studio 2. I had it from buying a Humble Bundle. As you can see, as soon as I run the combine command, the performance goes way up. Like, it's just a way smoother frame rate. So those two assets work pretty well together. That's about it for this dev vlog here. Next time I'm probably going to work maybe a bit on the combat system or on making the dungeon better or a new dungeon.